My husband spent my $17,000 car savings on a rusted 1994 truck that immediately broke down because it was practical. I showed him what practical means. I'd been saving for 3 years to buy a small hybrid sedan that got 50 miles per gallon because my commute to the hospital was 40 miles each way, and gas was destroying my budget. Every month, I'd put aside $400 from my nursing salary into a separate savings account that I'd opened just for this car. I had $17,000 saved and needed just $3,000 more for the exact car I'd been watching at the dealership. A silver sedan with heated seats and backup camera and Bluetooth that would make my daily drive bearable. My husband Victor knew about this savings and would joke about my little dream car while he drove his massive pickup that he used maybe twice a year to haul anything. Victor worked from home as a freelance graphic designer and barely drove anywhere, but insisted he needed a truck for those times he might buy lumber or help someone move, even though he'd never built anything and his back hurt too much to lift boxes. I showed Victor the car listing every week and counted down how many paychecks until I could buy it. He'd nod and say it was cute I had a goal while he browsed boats online that cost more than our house. 3 weeks before I hit my savings goal, I came home to find a rusted orange truck from 1994 parked in our driveway. It had different colored doors and a cracked windshield and exhaust that poured black smoke. Victor stood next to it, grinning and holding keys, saying he'd bought me a real vehicle, not some toy car. He said he'd seen this truck for sale and knew it was perfect for me because it was tough and reliable and would last forever. He said he'd used my savings account for the down payment and traded in my current dying sedan for the rest. He'd spent all $17,000 on this monstrosity that got 8 miles per gallon and had manual windows and no air conditioning. I asked Victor how I was supposed to drive 80 miles a day in a truck that drank gas like water, and he said I'd adapt and maybe I'd appreciate having something substantial instead of trendy. He said nurses should drive practical vehicles, not luxury cars, and this truck was practical because I could haul medical supplies if needed. We didn't haul medical supplies. The hospital had delivery trucks for that. He said I was being ungrateful when I started crying about my savings being gone. He said most husbands wouldn't even let their wives have separate savings, and he was generous for using it to buy me something better than what I wanted. The truck broke down on my first commute. The engine overheated 20 miles from work, and I had to call roadside assistance. The tow truck driver said the engine was shot and would cost $6,000 to replace. Victor said that was normal for older vehicles, and I should have checked the fluids. I hadn't wanted an older vehicle. I'd wanted my new hybrid. The second week, the transmission started slipping. The mechanic said it needed a full rebuild for $8,000. Victor said I was probably driving it wrong and trucks needed different handling than cars. The truck didn't have handling. It had suggestions that the wheels might consider following. Week 3, the electrical system failed, and the truck wouldn't start without a jump. The alternator was dead, the battery was corroded, and the whole system needed rewiring for $3,000. We'd now spent more on repairs than my original car would have cost. Victor said these were investments in a classic vehicle that would appreciate in value. It was depreciating every time it caught fire, which happened twice. Meanwhile, Victor's boat sat in our garage, taking up space. He'd bought it 5 years ago for $35,000, saying he'd use it every weekend, but had taken it out exactly 4 times. It needed constant maintenance that he paid for religiously, even though it never left the garage. He'd just spent $2,000 on new seats for a boat that hadn't touched water in 18 months. He polished it every Sunday and told anyone who'd listen about his plans for fishing trips that never happened. That's when I decided Victor needed to understand practical vehicles. I listed his boat on every sales site for half its value, saying it was an urgent sale due to family emergency. Within 2 days, I had 8 offers. I sold it to a dealer for $18,000 cash while Victor was at a client meeting. I told them my husband had asked me to handle it because he was too emotional about selling his baby. They towed it away before lunch. I took that $18,000 and bought 2 cars. First, the hybrid I'd originally wanted, which the dealership still had, and gave me a discount for my troubles after hearing my story. Second, a tiny electric car for $5,000 that was perfect for errands around town and cost nothing to charge. I parked both in the garage where the boat had been and waited. Victor came home and went straight to the garage to polish his boat like every evening. He stood there staring at 2 small cars where his boat should be. I watched him circle the hybrid sedan, running his fingers along the hood like he was checking for evidence of some crime. He peered through the windows of the little electric car, then walked to the back corner of the garage where the boat trailer used to sit. His shoulders were tight and his jaw was clenched, so hard I could see it from the kitchen. He pulled his phone from his pocket and stared at the screen, thumb hovering over it. I pushed away from the counter and walked through the laundry room into the garage before he could dial. He spun around when he heard my footsteps. His mouth opened, but no sound came out at first, just this strangled noise in his throat. Then he found his voice, and it came out sharp and controlled, like he was trying very hard not to scream. "Where is my boat?" Not a question, a demand. I kept my voice steady and calm, the same tone he'd used when he showed me that rusted truck. I sold it to buy myself a real vehicle, not some toy boat. His face went from pale to red in about 2 seconds. The veins in his neck stood out and his hands curled into fists at his sides. "You did what? You had no right to sell my property. That boat cost $35,000 and you just What, gave it away? I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe. I had no right? That's interesting coming from the man who spent my $17,000 without asking. And I didn't give it away. I sold it for $18,000 cash. $18,000? It's worth at least 30. You can't just sell someone's things. Funny, I thought the same thing when you traded in my car and emptied my savings account. Victor's hands were shaking now, and he took a step toward me, not threatening but desperate. That was different. The truck was for you. It was a gift. A gift I didn't want that you bought with my money. Your boat was something you wanted that I bought with your money. Seems pretty equal to me. He started pacing between the two cars, running his hands through his hair. Where did the money go? All 18,000? I gestured at the vehicles. Right here. The hybrid I've been saving for since before you decided I needed a truck that catches fire, plus a practical electric car for errands around town. Spent about the same amount you spent on my gift. You're insane. This is vindictive and crazy and theft. How does it feel, Victor? How does it feel to have someone make major financial decisions without asking you first? To come home and find out something you cared about is just gone? He stopped pacing and stared at me, his chest heaving. I can't believe you did this. I can't believe you would do something so spiteful. I can't believe you're surprised. Victor made this noise that was half laugh, half sob, and stormed past me into the house. I heard his footsteps heavy on the stairs, heard the office door slam hard enough to rattle the pictures on the wall. Then his voice, muffled but angry, talking to someone on the phone. Probably his mother, maybe one of his buddies from college, calling to complain about his crazy wife who sold his precious boat. I walked over to the hybrid and opened the driver's door. The interior still had that new car smell, clean and fresh with a hint of leather, even though the seats were cloth. I slid behind the wheel and wrapped my hands around it, feeling the smooth material under my palms. This was the steering wheel I'd pictured during every long shift at the hospital, every time I transferred another $400 into my savings account. The dashboard had the backup camera screen and the Bluetooth controls and the heated seat buttons I'd dreamed about. Everything was exactly where it should be, exactly what I'd wanted. My hands were shaking a little, not from fear or regret, but from the adrenaline of what I'd just done. Part of me felt powerful and justified, like I'd finally stood up for myself after years of Victor making unilateral decisions. Part of me felt sick with worry about what this meant for our marriage. We'd had fights before, plenty of them, but nothing like this. Nothing where we'd both crossed lines this big. The car smelled new and felt solid and comfortable under me. I'd made the right choice. I knew I had. Even if Victor never forgave me, even if this was the thing that broke us, I'd made the right choice. Victor didn't come down for dinner. I heard him in his office, the low rumble of his voice through the ceiling as I ate leftover pasta at the kitchen table. Every few minutes, the volume would spike like he was getting worked up again, then drop back down. I wondered who he was talking to and what he was saying about me, probably painting me as some vengeful psycho who destroyed his property out of spite. I pulled out my phone and called Daniela. She answered on the second ring. Hey, what's up? I did something. Okay, that tone means either really good or really bad. Which is it? I told her everything. The boat sale, the car purchases, Victor's reaction, all of it spilling out in a rush. There was silence on the other end for a few seconds after I finished. Then Daniela started laughing. Really laughing. The kind where she could barely breathe. Oh my God, you actually did it. You sold his stupid boat. Is that bad? Did I go too far? Are you kidding? You're my hero. He spent your savings on a truck that literally caught fire, and you're worried you went too far? He absolutely deserved to feel exactly what he put you through. He's so angry, Daniela. Like really, really angry. Good, he should be angry. Now he knows how you felt. Maybe he'll think twice before pulling something like that again. I don't know if our marriage is going to survive this. Her laughter faded and her voice got serious. Look, I'm not going to lie. You're probably in for some serious fallout. Victor's ego just took a massive hit and men like him don't handle that well. But you know what? If your marriage can't survive you standing up for yourself, then maybe it's not worth surviving. I pressed my palm against my forehead. That's easy to say when it's not your marriage. I know. I'm sorry. But I'm also not sorry because what you did was completely justified. Just be prepared, okay? This is going to get worse before it gets better. Victor was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs the next morning, standing by the coffee maker in his pajama pants and t-shirt. His eyes were red like he hadn't slept much. He didn't look at me when I walked in, just poured his coffee with careful, deliberate movements. Are you planning to return the money and buy back my property? His voice was flat and cold, no emotion in it at all. Somehow that was worse than the yelling. No. No? No. Just like you're not returning my savings to buy the car I actually wanted. He finally looked at me, his jaw tight. That's different. How is it different, Victor? The truck was for you. It was a gift, even if you're too stubborn to appreciate it. I poured my own coffee, keeping my hands steady even though I wanted to throw the mug at the wall. And the boat was supposedly for family recreation, for fishing trips and weekend outings. Except only you ever used it, the 4 times you actually took it out. At least my cars will both get used every single day. That's not the same thing. You're right, it's not. Because I actually needed reliable transportation for my commute, and you bought me a death trap. You wanted a toy to polish in the garage, and I sold it to buy something useful. Victor's face was red again, and his knuckles were white around his coffee mug. We're married. We're supposed to discuss major purchases together. You going behind my back was immature and vindictive. I stared at him. Actually stared, waiting to see if he would hear himself, if he would realize what he'd just said. He stared back, his expression self-righteous and wounded. I set my coffee down carefully. Are you actually hearing yourself right now? We're supposed to discuss major purchases together? That's your argument? He had the grace to look uncomfortable for about half a second before doubling down. My situation was different. I saw an opportunity to get you something practical and took it. What you did was purely out of spite to hurt me. You're unbelievable. I grabbed my coffee and my keys and walked out, leaving him standing in the kitchen with his mouth open like he had more to say. The hybrid drove like a dream. Smooth and quiet, the engine barely making a sound as I merged onto the highway. The seat was comfortable and adjusted to exactly the right position. The steering was responsive without being touchy. The gas gauge sat at full, and I knew it would barely move during my whole 40-mile commute. I pulled into the hospital parking lot feeling lighter than I had in weeks, despite the fight with Victor. This car was mine. I'd earned it with 3 years of careful saving, and even though the path to getting it had been messy, I had it now. Arav was getting out of his car 3 spots down and waved when he saw me. Then he did a double take and walked over. New car? What happened to the, orange situation? Long story. The orange situation is gone. Thank God. That thing looked like it was held together with rust and prayers. This is nice. This is the one you were saving for, right? Yeah, finally got it. He grinned and leaned against his car. Good for you. My wife would have done the same thing if I'd pulled something like that. Your husband sounds like he needed the lesson. I laughed despite myself. That's one way to put it. How'd he take it? About as well as you'd expect. Arav shook his head. Well, at least you've got a reliable car now. See you inside. Victor had apparently spent his whole day building a case. When I got home, there were papers spread across the kitchen table. Printouts from boat valuation websites, the original purchase receipt, maintenance records, everything organized in neat piles. He looked up when I walked in, his expression grim. I've been doing research. That boat was worth at least $28,000 in current condition. You undersold it by $10,000. You owe me that money. I dropped my bag on the counter and walked over to look at his documentation. Interesting. Want to see my research? I pulled out my phone and opened my photos, scrolling to the pictures I'd taken of all the repair bills for the truck. Engine replacement estimate, transmission rebuild quote, electrical system rewiring invoice. I held the phone out so he could see. We've spent over $17,000 trying to fix your practical gift. That's more than my car would have cost brand new. So if we're talking about who owes who money, I'd say we're about even. Victor's face went pale as he looked at the numbers. Those repairs were your responsibility. The truck was yours. I never wanted the truck. I never asked for the truck. You spent my money on it without permission and now you want me to pay to fix it too? How does that make any sense? It needed repairs because you didn't maintain it properly. It needed repairs because you bought a piece of junk that should have been in a scrapyard. The mechanic told me the engine was already shot when you bought it. You got scammed and used my money to do it. Victor gathered up his papers, shoving them into a folder. This isn't over. I'm going to figure out our legal options. Good luck with that. I'm sure a lawyer will be very interested in hearing how you emptied your wife's savings account without permission. My phone rang that evening while I was folding laundry. Victor's mother. I considered not answering, bracing myself for a lecture about respecting my husband and keeping the peace. But Keturah had always been kind to me, and avoiding her felt wrong. Hello? Hi, sweetie. Do you have a few minutes to talk? Her voice was calm, not angry or accusatory. I sat down on the edge of the bed. Sure. Victor called me yesterday, very upset. He told me you sold his boat. I wanted to hear your side of things before I said anything to him. I told her everything. The 3 years of saving, the truck purchase, the breakdowns, the boat sale, all of it. She listened without interrupting, making small noises of acknowledgement but not judgment. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Keturah? I'm here. I'm just thinking. I love my son very much, you know that. But he's always had this blind spot about his own wants versus other people's needs. Even when he was little, he'd take his sister's things because he had better ideas for how to use them. I thought he'd grown out of it. My throat felt tight. So you don't think I was wrong? I think you both made choices that hurt each other. But I also think Victor needed to understand what he did to you. And clearly talking wasn't working. Sometimes people need to feel consequences before they'll listen. She told me she'd always hoped he'd grow out of taking charge of other people's decisions. But watching him do it to his wife made her realize some patterns run deep. Her voice got quiet when she said she regretted not speaking up more in her own marriage, that maybe if she'd set better boundaries, her son wouldn't think it was normal to override someone else's choices. I felt tears building because having someone on my side, especially Victor's own mother, meant everything after days of him acting like I was the unreasonable one. She asked if I'd be willing to talk more over coffee sometime soon, just the two of us, and I agreed immediately. Before we hung up, she said she'd call Victor that week and have a real conversation about respect and partnership, though she warned me he never handled criticism well even as a kid. When his sister pointed out he'd taken her things, he'd get defensive and explain why his way was better instead of apologizing. I thanked her for listening and for understanding, and she said she loved her son. But that didn't mean she had to agree with everything he did. The next week felt like living with a stranger who happened to share my address. Victor stayed in his office most of the time, coming out for meals but eating quickly without conversation. I drove my hybrid to work each morning and loved every minute of the smooth, quiet ride, though the satisfaction felt hollow when I came home to cold silence. We passed each other in hallways without speaking, both of us too stubborn to break first. I slept on my side of the bed and he slept on his with a canyon of space between us. On Thursday, my sister showed up unannounced with takeout, taking one look at my face and pulling me into the kitchen while Victor stayed in his office. She asked if I was okay and I said I was fine, just tired from work, but she knew me too well to buy that. She pointed out the tension was so thick she could feel it the second she walked in the door. I admitted Victor and I weren't speaking much, that we were stuck in this awful pattern of both thinking we were right. She hugged me and said maybe the marriage needed to crack a little before it could be fixed properly, that sometimes things have to break down to be rebuilt stronger. I asked what if it was broken beyond fixing, and she said I wouldn't know unless we actually tried to repair it instead of just avoiding each other. Over pizza, she brought up marriage counseling, saying both Victor and I were too dug into our positions to work it out alone. She said we needed someone neutral to help us actually hear each other instead of just waiting for our turn to argue. I told her I'd thought about it but doubted Victor would agree, that he'd probably say therapy was unnecessary or that talking to strangers about private matters was pointless. She suggested I ask anyway, because the alternative was continuing this Cold War until one of us gave up completely. After she left, I sat with the idea for a while, dreading the conversation, but knowing she was right. That evening, I knocked on Victor's office door and waited for him to grunt permission before opening it. I said we needed to talk about seeing a marriage counselor because we clearly couldn't fix this ourselves. He looked up from his computer with surprise and then something like relief, though he covered it quickly. He said fine if that's what it would take to make me see reason about the whole situation, which wasn't exactly the supportive response I'd hoped for, but at least he was willing to go. I found a counselor named Reka through my insurance and booked an appointment for the following Tuesday evening. The office was in a small professional building with beige walls and generic landscape paintings that probably came from a hotel liquidation sale. We sat in the waiting room without talking, both of us pretending to look at our phones. When Reka called us back, we followed her into a room with two couches facing each other and a chair positioned between them. She was maybe 50 with glasses and a calm expression that gave nothing away. She asked us to explain why we were there, and Victor jumped in first, laying out his version of events like he was presenting evidence in court. He talked about buying me a practical vehicle and being shocked when I sold his boat without permission. I waited for my turn and then explained the 3 years of saving, the rusted truck that immediately broke down, and the $17,000 of my money he spent without asking. Reka listened to both of us without interrupting, her face staying neutral the whole time. When we finished, she looked at Victor and asked why he thought it was acceptable to spend his wife's savings without getting her permission first. He started explaining about trucks being more practical than small cars and how he was trying to help me, but he trailed off when her expression didn't change. She waited in the silence until he finally admitted he didn't really think about asking. He just saw the truck and knew it was better than what I wanted. Then Reka turned to me and asked why I chose to sell the boat instead of having a conversation with Victor about how his actions made me feel. I felt my defenses go up, but forced myself to answer honestly. I told her conversation was exactly what Victor denied me when he emptied my savings account. I explained that I wanted him to feel the same shock and violation I felt coming home to find my money gone and my plans destroyed. I said I needed him to understand what he'd done to me, and talking hadn't worked before, so I showed him instead. Reka nodded slowly and said we were both operating from hurt and anger instead of partnership. She said that was understandable given what happened, but it wasn't something we could sustain if we wanted the marriage to survive. She asked if we were willing to do the work to rebuild trust and communication, and we both said yes, though. Victor looked less certain than I felt. She gave us homework for the next session, telling each of us to write down what we actually wanted from the marriage and what we were willing to change to get there. Victor took the paper she handed us and folded it precisely before putting it in his pocket. I spent 2 days working on my homework list, crossing out and rewriting until I had something that felt true. I wrote about wanting equal decision-making power, about needing financial autonomy and respect for my goals. I wrote about wanting a partner who asked instead of decided, who valued my input as much as his own opinions. Victor finished his list in one sitting at the kitchen table, writing quickly like he'd already had it all figured out. When we went back to Reka's office the following week, she asked us to share what we'd written. Victor read his list first, and it was all about respect and consultation. about partners needing to discuss major decisions together. He talked about the importance of trust and communication in marriage. I sat there listening and feeling anger build because he was demanding things he'd completely violated. My list focused on the same concepts but from the opposite direction, asking for things I thought we already had, but clearly didn't. Reka let us both finish, and then looked at Victor with a thoughtful expression. She asked if he saw the contradiction in his list, in demanding respect and consultation that he hadn't given me. The room got very quiet. Victor stared at his paper for a long time before speaking. He said he'd always thought of my income as family money that we both had access to, while his income and his purchases were more his personal domain. The words hung in the air between us, and I felt something shift in my chest. This wasn't just about a truck or a boat. This was about him seeing our finances and our marriage as fundamentally unequal. Reka asked him to explain that model and where it came from. He talked about his parents, about his dad making the major decisions while his mom handled the house and kids. I interrupted to point out that his mother had told me she hated that arrangement, that she wished she'd stood up for herself earlier in her marriage. Victor looked genuinely surprised, saying his mom never complained and always seemed happy with how things were. I told him about our phone conversation and what she'd shared about her regrets. Something changed in his expression, confusion mixing with discomfort. Reka suggested he talk to his mother directly about her experience instead of assuming he understood it. He agreed, but I could tell he thought I'd misunderstood what she meant. The next week dragged while I waited to see if Victor would actually talk to his mom or just avoid the conversation. On Saturday, he texted saying he was meeting her for lunch and would be back later. I spent the afternoon cleaning the house and trying not to check my phone every 5 minutes. When he finally came home around 4, his whole demeanor was different, subdued and thoughtful instead of his usual defensive posture. He sat down at the kitchen table and I joined him, waiting for him to speak first. He said his mother had told him things about his father's behavior that he'd never noticed as a kid. She'd explained how his dad made all the financial decisions without consulting her, how she'd wanted to go back to the school, but he'd said it wasn't necessary since he earned enough. She told Victor she loved his father, but wished their marriage had been more of a partnership, that she didn't want to see her son repeat the same patterns that had made her feel small and unimportant. Victor's voice was quiet when he said he'd never realized his mom felt that way, that he'd always thought their marriage was happy and traditional. I reached across the table and touched his hand, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't pull away. Our next session the following week felt different from the start. Victor sat forward in his chair instead of slouching defensively, and when we finished going over the week's events, he cleared his throat and looked directly at me. He said he wanted to apologize. Really apologize. Not just explain himself or justify what he did. His voice was steady, but quiet as he admitted the truck purchase was about him thinking he knew better than me, not about what I actually needed for my daily commute. He said he'd convinced himself he was being practical, when really he was being controlling, deciding for me instead of with me. The apology wasn't perfect, because he still seemed confused about exactly why his logic had been so wrong, but hearing him actually say the words without defensive explanations felt like progress. I watched his face as he spoke, and saw genuine discomfort there, the kind that comes from admitting you were wrong instead of finding ways around it. I told him I accepted his apology, but I wasn't sorry for selling the boat because he needed to understand how violation feels. The words came out firmer than I expected, and Victor flinched slightly but nodded. He said he'd been furious when he found the boat gone, felt completely betrayed that I'd sold his property without asking, and then stopped himself mid-sentence. He admitted that fury and betrayal was probably exactly how I felt, coming home to find my savings spent on a truck I never wanted. His acknowledgement landed between us like something solid and real. Reka leaned forward slightly, looking pleased with this exchange, and asked what we wanted to do moving forward with our finances and decision-making. The question hung there while Victor and I looked at each other, both of us knowing we couldn't go back to how things were before. The next session focused entirely on money and boundaries. Reka suggested separate accounts for personal spending beyond our shared household expenses, each of us controlling our own earnings after we contributed to joint bills. Victor resisted immediately, saying married people should share everything, that separate accounts meant we didn't trust each other. I pointed out he'd never shared decision-making even when we had combined money, that access to funds didn't equal partnership. We went back and forth for 20 minutes, Reka letting us work through it ourselves, until Victor finally agreed to try the system for 3 months. We'd each contribute to mortgage, utilities, groceries, and insurance, then keep the rest of our paychecks for personal use and savings. It felt both practical and sad, like we were building walls inside our marriage, but also necessary after what had happened. Setting up the separate accounts the following week brought a strange mix of feelings. The bank representative walked us through paperwork while Victor sat stiffly beside me, signing forms with tight, precise movements. I felt liberated knowing my savings would be truly mine again, but also sad that we needed this separation to function. Daniela's husband, Nasser, helped us figure out fair contribution percentages based on our actual incomes, sitting at our kitchen table with a calculator and our pay stubs. Victor earned about 15% more than me between his graphic design clients, So Nasser suggested he contribute 55% to household expenses while I contributed 45%. Victor agreed without argument, which surprised me, and we set up automatic transfers to our new joint account for bills. Walking out of the bank with my own account card felt like reclaiming something I'd lost, even though I'd had a separate savings before and Victor had violated it anyway. The rusted truck still sat in our driveway like a monument to the whole disaster. Every time I pulled in with my hybrid or the little electric car, I saw that orange eyesore with its mismatched doors and cracked windshield. Victor brought it up one evening, suggesting we try to sell it and recoup something from the mess. I called Xavier, the mechanic who'd done all those failed repairs, and he came by the next day to give us an honest assessment. He walked around the truck shaking his head, then told us straight that it was worth maybe $2,000 in current condition, possibly less given all the documented mechanical issues. We'd spent $17,000 buying it and another $10,000 trying to fix it, so $2,000 felt like adding insult to injury. Victor and I looked at each other across the hood of that terrible truck and simultaneously agreed to just donate it for a tax write-off. The tow truck came 2 days later and hauled it away, both of us standing in the driveway watching it disappear down the street, relieved to see the last of it. Victor approached me a few days after the truck was gone, asking carefully if I'd consider selling one of my cars since we now had 3 vehicles for 2 people and only 2 parking spots in the garage. I looked at him steadily and said, no, firmly, and without room for negotiation. I explained the hybrid was for my 80-mile daily commute, and the electric car was for errands around town, both serving actual practical purposes unlike his boat that sat unused for years. He opened his mouth like he wanted to argue about fairness, then closed it again. I watched him physically bite back whatever he'd been about to say, his jaw working as he processed that fairness would have been asking before spending my money in the first place. He nodded slowly and dropped the subject, and I could see something shifting in how he understood our situation. At work the following week, my nurse manager Sade stopped by the break room where I was eating lunch. She commented that I seemed less stressed lately, my shoulders not up around my ears like they'd been for months. I gave her a quick version of the truck and boat situation while we ate our sandwiches, and she started laughing so hard she nearly choked. She told me her husband had tried something similar years ago with a motorcycle, spending their vacation fund on a bike he rode exactly 3 times before it sat rusting in their yard. She said standing up for yourself in marriage is hard but necessary, that too many women just accept their husband's decisions quietly and end up resentful. Her validation meant something coming from someone who'd been married 20 years and seemed genuinely happy. She squeezed my shoulder before heading back to her rounds, saying she was glad I hadn't just swallowed my anger and pretended everything was fine. Therapy continued every week, and we started digging into patterns beyond just the immediate financial conflict. Rekha pointed out that Victor often dismissed my concerns or explained why his perspective was more valid, talking over me or redirecting conversations back to his logic. He got defensive hearing this, insisting he was just trying to help me see things clearly, which proved her point exactly. But over the next few sessions, he started catching himself doing it, stopping mid-sentence when he realized he was explaining my own feelings back to me. The self-awareness was uncomfortable to watch, his face tightening every time Rekha gently noted another instance, but it was necessary progress. He couldn't change patterns he didn't recognize, and recognition was painful. One session, Victor admitted something that clearly cost him effort to say out loud. He told Rekha he'd always thought of himself as the practical one in our marriage, the rational thinker who made smart decisions while I was more emotional and impulsive. Hearing that I'd been saving methodically for 3 years while he spent impulsively on boats and truck projects challenged his entire self-image. His voice was quiet as he worked through this realization, admitting his view of himself didn't match reality. Rekha asked gently if maybe we both had different kinds of practical wisdom. That discipline and planning were just as valuable as whatever Victor thought he brought. He sat with that for a long moment, before grudgingly agreeing that my financial planning might actually be more disciplined than his spontaneous purchases. The admission seemed to physically hurt him, but he said it anyway. 2 weeks into our new financial arrangement, Victor and I were making dinner together when he mentioned a movie he wanted to see. I said I'd been wanting to see it too, and we started discussing the plot and actors, just talking normally about something that wasn't our problems. The conversation flowed easily, Victor making jokes about the ridiculous trailer and me laughing at his impressions of the dramatic voiceover. It felt normal and comfortable, reminding me why I'd married him in the first place. He was funny and smart when he wasn't being defensive or trying to prove he was right, and I realized I'd missed just enjoying his company without all the tension hanging between us. We decided to go see the movie that weekend, and the simple plan felt like something healthy couples did, not 2 people constantly negotiating conflict. The movie ended up being better than the trailer suggested, and we walked out of the theater holding hands and actually smiling at each other. Victor suggested getting ice cream on the way home, something we used to do early in our marriage before everything got so tense and complicated. We sat in the parking lot with our cones melting in the summer heat, talking about the plot holes in the movie and laughing about the terrible special effects. It felt normal and easy, reminding me of why I'd fallen for him in the first place. back when he was funny and charming instead of controlling and dismissive. On the drive home, Victor mentioned that we hadn't taken a real vacation in over a year because he was always busy maintaining the boat or planning theoretical fishing trips that never happened. I pointed out the irony that we were finally making time for each other now that the boat was gone, and he laughed in this self-aware way that showed he actually got it. He pulled up a website on his phone and showed me listings for small cabins on the coast, asking which ones looked good to me instead of just picking one himself. We scrolled through options together, discussing which beaches we wanted to explore and what restaurants looked interesting, and the planning felt like a team effort instead of Victor making decisions and me going along with them. We booked a cabin for the following weekend and both requested Friday off work, and I felt hopeful that maybe we were actually rebuilding something real instead of just pretending everything was fine. The weekend at the coast started well, with the drive down feeling relaxed and full of easy conversation about nothing important. We stopped at a roadside fruit stand and bought strawberries that we ate in the car, getting juice on our fingers and laughing about the mess. The cabin was small but clean, with big windows overlooking the beach and a deck where we could hear the waves. Victor unpacked our bags while I made sandwiches for lunch, and we fell into comfortable routines that felt almost like the early days of our marriage. We walked on the beach that afternoon, shoes off and pants rolled up, letting the cold water rush over our feet. Victor found a perfect sand dollar and handed it to me like it was treasure, and I tucked it carefully in my pocket. Dinner was at a seafood place with red checkered tablecloths where we shared a platter of fried fish and hush puppies, talking about work and movies and normal couple things. But underneath the easy moments was this careful politeness, both of us trying hard not to bring up anything that might start a fight. When Victor mentioned wanting to check out a marine supply store the next day, he quickly added that we didn't have to if I didn't want to, watching my face for signs of anger. I could feel myself doing the same thing, editing my words before speaking to avoid triggering old arguments about money or respect, or his tendency to dismiss my opinions. We were being so careful with each other that some conversations felt forced and artificial, like we were playing the roles of a happy couple instead of actually being one. Saturday, we hiked along the coastal trail, stopping to take pictures of the rock formations and tide pools full of tiny crabs and sea stars. Victor held my hand on the steep parts and didn't complain when I wanted to stop and look at every interesting shell or piece of driftwood. We found a secluded spot and sat on the rocks eating the lunch we'd packed, watching seals play in the waves below us. The moment felt peaceful and real, like we were finally partners instead of people constantly fighting for control. That evening, we cooked dinner together in the cabin's tiny kitchen, Victor chopping vegetables while I seasoned the fish we'd bought at the market. We worked around each other easily, passing utensils and ingredients without needing to ask, falling into a rhythm that reminded me we'd done this before when things were good. After dinner, we sat on the deck wrapped in blankets, drinking wine and watching the sunset turn the ocean orange and pink. Victor apologized again for the truck, saying he'd been thinking a lot about how he'd dismissed what I actually needed in favor of what he thought I should want. I told him I was sorry for selling the boat without talking to him first, even though I still believed he'd needed to feel what I felt. We agreed that we'd both handled things badly, but maybe the crisis had forced us to actually deal with problems we'd been ignoring for years. The conversation felt honest instead of defensive, and I went to bed that night, feeling like maybe we really could fix this marriage if we both kept trying. Back home on Monday, Victor asked my opinion about new computer equipment he needed for a client project, showing me 3 different monitor options and actually listening when I pointed out which one had better reviews. It was such a small thing, but so different from his usual pattern of announcing what he'd already decided to buy. He pulled up the specifications and we discussed the budget together, and he ended up choosing the mid-range option instead of the most expensive one because I mentioned we should probably save money after all the recent chaos. The fact that he actually considered my input instead of just doing what he wanted felt strange and unfamiliar, like learning a new language after years of speaking only one way. Over the next few days, he kept checking with me before making decisions, asking which brand of coffee to buy or if I wanted him to schedule the lawn service for Tuesday or Wednesday. At first, I appreciated the consideration, but then started feeling suspicious, wondering if this was real change or just temporary good behavior to smooth things over. I caught myself waiting for him to slip back into old patterns, to make some unilateral decision that proved he hadn't really learned anything. The suspicion felt ugly and unfair, but I couldn't shake it. Years of being dismissed, making it hard to trust that he'd actually changed. In our next therapy session, I admitted to feeling suspicious of Victor's improved behavior, explaining that I kept waiting for him to backslide into treating me like my opinions didn't matter. Reika asked if I was giving Victor room to actually change, or if I was punishing him for past behavior by refusing to acknowledge progress. The question made me uncomfortable because I realized I was doing exactly that, holding on to anger and hurt instead of meeting his efforts halfway. She pointed out that change is hard and imperfect, and if I kept waiting for him to fail, then I wasn't really giving our marriage a chance to improve. Victor sat quietly while Reika talked, and I could see him processing this validation that he was actually trying. Reika asked us both what we needed from each other moving forward, and I said I needed time to rebuild trust and proof that the changes were permanent, not just temporary performance. Victor said he needed me to acknowledge when he got things right instead of only pointing out when he messed up, which was fair, even though it hurt to hear. We agreed to both try harder, me to let go of grudges and him to keep consulting me on decisions, and the session ended with homework to notice and appreciate each other's efforts, instead of focusing on failures. Victor's friend came over the following Saturday to help move some furniture, and he asked about the boat while they were carrying the couch. I watched from the kitchen as Victor explained that he'd sold it to focus on other priorities, saying the boat had been taking up space and money for something he never actually used. His friend made some joke about midlife crisis purchases, and Victor laughed, agreeing that buying the boat had been more about the idea of being a boat owner than actually wanting to go fishing. He didn't mention that I'd sold it or throw me under the bus for making the decision without him, just framed it as something we'd decided together. After his friend left, I thanked Victor for not making me the villain in the story when he easily could have. He was quiet for a moment, and then said he was starting to understand that he'd been the villain in our actual story, making decisions that hurt me, and then acting like I was wrong for being upset. The admission seemed to cost him something to say out loud, and I appreciated the honesty, even though part of me wanted to agree loudly that yes, he had been the villain. Instead, I told him that we'd both made mistakes, and what mattered was whether we could do better going forward, and he nodded and pulled me into a hug that felt genuine instead of performative. 3 months after the boat sale, we'd settled into new patterns that felt more balanced than our old dynamic. Victor still had moments where he wanted to take charge and make decisions without consulting me, but he caught himself more often and actually asked for my input. I noticed I was less defensive and more willing to compromise on things that didn't really matter, like what color to paint the bathroom or which restaurant to try for dinner. I saved my firm boundaries for the important stuff like finances and major purchases, and Victor seemed to respect those limits now that he understood I'd enforce them. We'd established a rhythm where we both contributed to household decisions, instead of Victor dictating and me either complying or fighting. The separate bank accounts helped a lot, giving us each control over our own money while still contributing fairly to shared expenses. Victor had started saving for another boat, a smaller one this time that he could actually use for day trips, instead of a massive thing that lived in the garage. I didn't object because it was his money and his choice, and he didn't pressure me to contribute or suggest we should share the cost. The financial independence felt healthy and adult, like we were two separate people choosing to build a life together instead of one person controlling everything. Victor's mother visited on a Thursday afternoon, and she commented immediately on how much calmer our home felt compared to her last visit months ago. She said she could tell we'd been working on things, that the tension that used to fill every room had lifted. Victor told her about the therapy sessions and the separate finances, explaining how we'd restructured our marriage to be more equal. She approved strongly, saying she wished she'd set better boundaries with Victor's father, instead of just accepting his control over their finances and decisions. Later, she pulled me aside while Victor was making coffee, and thanked me for not giving up on her son, saying he'd needed someone strong enough to call him out on his behavior. She admitted she'd worried I would leave after the truck incident, and she wouldn't have blamed me if I had. I told her I'd considered it seriously, that selling the boat had been partly revenge, but also partly a test to see if Victor could understand what he'd done wrong. She squeezed my hand and said sometimes men needed dramatic lessons because subtle hints didn't work, and she was glad I'd found a way to make him actually listen. The validation from Victor's own mother meant more than I expected, confirmation that I hadn't been crazy or unreasonable for being angry about the truck. At work the following week, my coworker Arav asked how things were going with Victor while we were restocking supplies in the medication room. I told him we were in a better place, but it had taken serious work and therapy and almost ending the marriage. He shared that he and his wife had gone through something similar early in their marriage, a crisis about him making a major career decision without consulting her that had nearly destroyed their relationship. He said it took that real crisis to force them to address the power imbalance and communication problems they'd been ignoring. Hearing that other couples struggled with the same dynamics made me feel less alone, like Victor and I weren't uniquely broken. Arav said his wife had given him an ultimatum that either they went to counseling or she was leaving, and the ultimatum had been the wake-up call he needed to take her seriously. I realized that selling the boat had been my version of that ultimatum, a dramatic action that forced Victor to understand I wouldn't just accept being dismissed and controlled. Arav told me he was glad we'd worked things out because he'd seen how stressed I'd been during the truck disaster, and he'd worried about me driving that death trap every day. Victor and I celebrated our anniversary quietly with dinner at home, both of us acknowledging it had been a rough year for our marriage. He'd made reservations at a nice restaurant, but I'd suggested staying home instead, wanting something intimate and private. We cooked together, making the meal we'd had on our first date, and it felt symbolic of trying to rebuild what we'd started with. After dinner, Victor gave me a card that he'd clearly spent time writing, not just a generic store message. Inside, he apologized again for the truck and everything it represented, and thanked me for not leaving when things got bad. He wrote that he'd learned he had a wife who was stronger and smarter than he'd given her credit for, and he was grateful I'd fought for our marriage instead of just accepting dysfunction. I teared up reading it because the words showed he really understood what he'd done wrong, not just going through motions to keep the peace. I gave him a card too, thanking him for being willing to change and do the hard work of therapy, even when it was uncomfortable. We spent the rest of the evening talking about the good memories from our marriage, reminding ourselves why we'd chosen each other in the first place. In our next therapy session, Rekha asked what we'd each learned from this whole experience, wanting us to articulate the growth we'd achieved. Victor said he'd learned his wife was tougher than he'd given her credit for, that I had my own kind of strength that didn't look like his but was just as valid. He admitted he'd always thought of himself as the strong one who made the hard decisions, but watching me methodically save for 3 years and then decisively handle the boat situation showed him I had discipline and determination he lacked. I said I'd learned I could stand up for myself even when it was uncomfortable and scary, that I didn't have to accept being dismissed or controlled just to keep the peace. I told Rekha that selling the boat had been terrifying, because I didn't know if Victor would leave, or if our marriage could survive that level of conflict. But I'd done it anyway, because some things were worth fighting for. Rekha smiled and said we'd both learned we were strong enough to fight for our marriage instead of just accepting dysfunction, that we'd chosen the hard path of actually fixing problems instead of the easy path of pretending everything was fine. Rekha leaned forward in her chair during our next session and asked if we wanted to keep coming weekly, or if we felt ready to space things out. Victor glanced at me, and then back at her, saying he thought monthly might work better than stopping completely. I agreed because the weekly sessions had helped us stay on track, and I worried we'd slip back into old habits without that regular check-in. Rekha nodded and said monthly sessions could provide accountability while giving us space to practice what we'd learned. Victor admitted he probably would have said therapy was a waste of time 6 months ago, but now he saw how much it helped us actually talk, instead of just arguing in circles. 2 weeks later, I got called into my manager's office and my stomach dropped because those conversations never went well. Saad smiled and told me I was getting a small raise for my performance and dedication, and I felt relief wash over me. The raise wasn't huge, maybe an extra $150 a month, but it felt significant after everything. The first thing I did was transfer that amount into my car savings account that I'd reopened after buying the hybrid. Victor noticed the transfer notification on our joint banking app and asked what I was saving for now since I already had my dream car. I told him maybe a vacation, or maybe just having security in case something happened, and he nodded without trying to tell me what I should do with my money. Victor surprised me a few days later by saying he'd booked a meeting with a financial planner to talk about retirement and his spending habits. I asked what made him decide to do that, and he said, watching me save carefully for 3 years made him realize he had no actual plan for the future. He'd always just spent what he wanted and figured things would work out somehow, but seeing my discipline made him understand that wasn't sustainable. The financial planner was a woman named Andrea, who asked Victor detailed questions about his income and expenses and where he saw himself in 20 years. She helped him set up automatic transfers to a retirement account and created a budget for his freelance income that included specific amounts for bills, savings, and personal spending. Victor seemed both relieved and uncomfortable having structure imposed on his impulsive habits, but he stuck with it. We invited Daniela and Nasser over for dinner on a Saturday night, and I realized while cooking that I wasn't nervous about it like I would have been months ago. The evening felt relaxed and fun with everyone laughing and talking, without the tense undercurrent that used to exist. Daniela pulled me into the kitchen while I was getting dessert, and said Victor seemed different, more engaged and less dismissive when people talked. I told her therapy was helping a lot, and so was him actually facing real consequences for his actions instead of just getting away with everything. She hugged me tight and said she was proud of how I'd handled the whole situation, that selling the boat took guts. A few weeks later, Victor mentioned casually while we were watching TV that he'd been looking at smaller boats online. I felt my shoulders tense automatically, but kept my voice neutral when I asked what kind. He said the car top kind that you could transport on a roof rack instead of storing in a garage, watching my face carefully for my reaction. I told him if he saved up his personal spending money and it didn't affect our joint finances, I didn't care what he bought. His whole body relaxed, and he said he'd probably wait a year or two anyway because he wanted to rebuild his savings first. The fact that he asked instead of just buying something felt like real progress. The electric car's dashboard started showing a service reminder, and Victor offered to take it to the shop for me since he was home during the day. It was a small thing, but it showed he was thinking about being helpful instead of assuming I'd handle everything myself. I accepted and thanked him, and he seemed genuinely pleased to contribute in a practical way. He came home later with the receipt and a detailed explanation of what they'd checked, like he wanted me to know he'd paid attention. I was scrolling through my phone one evening when I realized I'd stopped feeling angry every time I thought about the truck incident. The sharp edge of betrayal had faded into something more like a bad memory we'd survived together, instead of something that still hurt. Victor noticed me smiling and asked what was funny, so I showed him a meme about terrible husband gifts that someone had posted. He laughed and said at least his truck disaster led to positive changes, even if he wished he'd learned the lesson differently. In our monthly session with Rekha, she asked how we'd handle a similar situation now if one of us wanted to make a major purchase. Victor and I looked at each other and then took turns describing how we'd discuss budget and priorities and find a compromise that worked for both of us. Reka pointed out that we were actually communicating like partners now instead of like opponents, something we clearly weren't doing before. She suggested we might be ready to transition to quarterly check-ins instead of monthly since we seemed to have the tools we needed. Victor's birthday was coming up and I wasn't sure what to get him since his usual expensive toys were off the table with our new budget boundaries. I asked him directly what he'd actually like, and he thought about it for a while before saying he'd enjoy a nice dinner out and maybe tickets to a concert. The simplicity of the request surprised me because he used to want the biggest and best version of everything. I found tickets to a band he liked and made reservations at a restaurant we'd been to on our anniversary years ago. The concert was genuinely fun without any tension or unresolved arguments hanging over us. Victor held my hand during the slow songs and I leaned against his shoulder, feeling like we were finally on the same team instead of constantly fighting. On the drive home in my hybrid, he ran his hand along the dashboard and said it really was a nice car. He added that he was glad I got what I wanted, even if the path there was messy, and I squeezed his hand in response. The baby shower was at my co-worker's house on a Saturday afternoon, with pink decorations everywhere and a table loaded with tiny clothes and bottles. I brought a gift basket of practical items like burp cloths and diaper cream, things I knew from watching Daniela with her kids years ago. The hostess was another nurse from my floor, someone I worked with on night shifts, but didn't know well outside the hospital. About 15 women sat in the living room playing silly games and eating cake shaped like a baby carriage. The conversation started normal enough, talking about nursery colors and stroller brands, but then someone mentioned her husband bought a crib without consulting her and it didn't match anything. Another woman laughed and said her husband did the same with a changing table that was too tall to use comfortably. I found myself sharing a shorter version of the truck and boat story, leaving out some of the more embarrassing details, but keeping the main points about Victor spending my savings and me selling his boat. The room went quiet for a second, and then multiple women started laughing, not at me, but in recognition. One woman said her husband bought a jet ski last summer, without asking, spent $8,000 they didn't have, and she returned it the next day while he was at work. She said sometimes men need direct lessons about partnership because talking doesn't always work. Another woman nodded and said her husband bought a motorcycle, and she made him sell it within a week, telling him if he wanted toys, he needed to save his own money. We spent the next hour sharing stories about husbands making unilateral decisions, and I realized this wasn't just a Victor problem or a me problem, but something a lot of women dealt with. The consensus seemed to be that some men genuinely didn't understand equal partnership until they experienced the same treatment they gave out. I left feeling less alone in the whole mess, like maybe my reaction wasn't crazy after all. Victor and I were sitting at the kitchen table the following week with my laptop open, looking at vacation destinations for next summer. We hadn't taken a real trip in years because money always went to his boat maintenance or other expensive hobbies he never actually used. I suggested the mountains because I wanted hiking and cool weather, and he mentioned the beach because he liked swimming and seafood. Instead of arguing about whose idea was better, we started looking for places that had both, finding a coastal area with trails and good restaurants. He asked what my budget was, and I told him, and he agreed it was reasonable without trying to spend more or less. We looked at rental houses together, discussing which ones had the amenities we each wanted, neither of us dismissing the other's preferences. The collaborative planning felt strange at first because I kept waiting for Victor to take over and decide everything, but he didn't. He asked my opinion on different options and actually listened when I explained why I liked or didn't like certain features. We settled on a place that had a deck overlooking the water and was close to hiking trails, booking it for a week in July. The whole process took about an hour and felt healthy and equal, like we were actually partners making decisions together. Victor seemed pleased with our choice and started talking about things we could do there, including me in all his plans instead of just announcing what he wanted. I realized this was what I'd been wanting all along, just basic respect and collaboration instead of being steamrolled. Katura called me on a Tuesday evening while I was doing laundry, her voice thoughtful and a little hesitant. She said she'd been thinking about our situation with the truck and boat, about how Victor and I worked through our problems in therapy. Then she told me she'd started setting better boundaries with Victor's father about retirement decisions, things she'd let him control for 40 years. She explained that his father wanted to sell their house and move to a retirement community, without really asking what she wanted, just assuming she'd go along with his plan. Katura said watching us fight for equal partnership inspired her to speak up about wanting to stay in their house, the place where she'd raised her kids and built her life. She told her husband they needed to discuss options together instead of him just deciding, and apparently he was shocked that she had opinions about their future. I listened to her talk about finally using her voice after decades of going along with whatever her husband wanted, and I felt touched that our struggle helped someone else. She thanked me for not giving up on Victor and for showing her that it's never too late to demand respect in a marriage. I told her I was proud of her for standing up for herself, even after 40 years of a certain pattern. She laughed and said maybe she should have sold his boat years ago, and we both knew she was only half joking. The conversation made me think about how problems in relationships often pass down through families, and how breaking those patterns can help more people than just yourself. The holidays approached faster than I expected, and Victor surprised me by asking how I wanted to handle gift budgets, instead of just spending whatever he wanted. We sat down with our separate account information and agreed on reasonable amounts for each other and family members, writing it all down so there wouldn't be confusion later. He suggested $200 each for our gifts to each other, and I agreed that felt fair. We decided on $50 per family member, which meant we could get nice presents without going overboard. Victor stuck to the budget without complaint, actually showing me receipts and discussing what he'd bought to make sure he wasn't over. Christmas morning felt different this year, more meaningful somehow because we'd planned together and respected our agreements. I opened a set of quality hiking boots from Victor, something I'd mentioned wanting for our summer vacation, and he opened a new tablet for his design work that he'd been eyeing. The gifts showed we'd actually listened to each other instead of just buying random things or making unilateral expensive purchases. We spent the day at Daniela's house with her family, and Victor was relaxed and present instead of sulking about money or comparing gifts. On the drive home, he said this was the best Christmas we'd had in years, and I agreed. The holiday felt like evidence that we'd built something better than what we had before, even if the path there was rough. My hybrid hit 10,000 miles on a cold January morning, and I noticed the milestone on my way to work. I'd been tracking my gas expenses since buying the car, amazed by how little I spent compared to my old sedan or that terrible truck Victor bought. Over dinner that evening, I showed Victor the numbers, explaining that I'd spent about $1,200 on gas in 6 months of commuting. He looked at the figures and admitted he never actually calculated the fuel costs of the truck he bought me, just assumed trucks were practical because they were tough. I pointed out that practical means different things depending on actual use case, that a truck getting 8 miles per gallon wasn't practical for someone driving 80 miles a day. He nodded slowly and said he should have listened to what I needed for my specific commute, instead of deciding what he thought was best. The admission felt significant because it showed he understood the core problem wasn't just about money, but about respect and listening. I told him the hybrid had saved me enough in gas costs to pay for a nice vacation, and he smiled, saying at least something good came from the whole mess. We calculated that the truck would have cost me over $3,000 in gas for the same mileage, not counting the repair bills that kept piling up. Victor looked genuinely surprised by the math, like he'd never considered the actual daily costs of his practical gift. We had a minor argument about household chores on a Saturday morning, something about dishes piling up in the sink and laundry not getting done. I brought it up calmly, saying I needed help keeping up with everything while working full-time. Victor's first instinct seemed to be defending himself, but he stopped and actually listened instead. He didn't dismiss my concerns or try to logic his way out of doing dishes, just acknowledged his share and started loading the dishwasher. We talked through a basic division of labor, deciding he'd handle dishes and trash while I did laundry and bathroom cleaning. The whole discussion took maybe 10 minutes, and we reached a compromise without it turning into a bigger fight about respect or partnership. These small moments of functional partnership felt like evidence that real change had happened, that we'd learned how to handle disagreements without everything exploding. Victor did the dishes that evening without being reminded, and I noticed he'd also wiped down the counters. Later that week, he took out the trash before it overflowed, and even replaced the bag without being asked. The daily cooperation felt more important than the big dramatic gestures, like we were finally figuring out how to be a team in ordinary life. Daniela called me at work during my lunch break, her voice excited and a little nervous. She was pregnant again, expecting her third child in late summer, and wanted to share the news before telling the rest of the family. I congratulated her and asked how she was feeling, and she said tired, but happy. That evening, I told Victor about Daniela's pregnancy, and we both agreed to help set up the nursery when the time came. Victor seemed genuinely excited to be an uncle again, asking thoughtful questions about what they'd need and whether they were hoping for a boy or girl. Planning to support my sister together gave us a shared project that was about someone else, taking pressure off our own relationship for a while. We started thinking about what gifts would be most useful, discussing cribs and car seats and all the practical items new parents need. Victor suggested we could help paint the nursery or assemble furniture, offering his time and effort instead of just buying something expensive. I appreciated his enthusiasm and the way he included me in all the planning, asking what I thought they'd need based on my nursing experience. Daniela seemed touched when we called her together to offer our help, saying she was grateful to have family support. The whole conversation felt normal and healthy, like we were functioning as a couple instead of as two people trapped in the same house. I got promoted to a senior nurse position in February, with better pay and more responsibility on my floor. The promotion meant leading a small team and handling more complex patient cases, something I'd been working toward for 2 years. I came home and told Victor the news, expecting him to be supportive, but worried he might show hints of competition or jealousy like he used to. Instead, he immediately suggested taking me out to celebrate, making reservations at a nice restaurant without any hesitation. At dinner, he toasted my success and said he was proud of my dedication, and I could tell he meant it. The genuine support felt different from the patronizing approval he used to give when he thought of himself as the primary breadwinner. He asked questions about my new responsibilities and listened to my answers, treating my career as important rather than secondary to his work. I realized this was the first time in our marriage that Victor had celebrated my professional success, without making it about himself. The promotion came with a significant raise, and Victor didn't try to claim it for joint spending or suggest how I should use it. He just congratulated me and said I'd earned it through hard work, which was exactly what I needed to hear. The evening felt like another marker of how far we'd come, proof that he could support my achievements without feeling threatened. Our quarterly therapy check-in with Rekha went well, both of us noting improvements in how we communicated and handled conflicts. Rekha asked specific questions about our daily interactions and decision-making processes, and we gave examples of recent situations we'd navigated successfully. She pointed out that we were using the tools she'd taught us, actually applying the communication techniques instead of just nodding along in sessions. Victor talked about catching himself before dismissing my concerns, and I mentioned feeling more confident speaking up when something bothered me. Rekha asked if we felt ready to handle challenges without regular sessions, suggesting we had the skills now to work through problems on our own. We both agreed we felt more equipped but wanted to keep quarterly check-ins as a safety net, making sure we didn't slide back into old patterns. Victor thanked Rekha for helping him see his blind spots about control and respect, admitting he wouldn't have recognized the problems without outside perspective. I thanked her for creating space where both our perspectives mattered equally, for not taking sides but holding us both accountable. Rekha smiled and said she was proud of our progress, that we'd done the hard work of actually changing instead of just complaining about problems. She scheduled our next appointment for 3 months out, and told us to call if we needed support before then. 6 months after the boat sale, Victor and I were sitting in the garage on a Sunday afternoon, looking at my 2 cars and the empty space where his boat used to be. The hybrid was parked on the left, clean and reliable, and the little electric car sat on the right, perfect for short trips around town. Victor stood in the middle of the empty space where he used to polish his boat every weekend, and I could tell he was thinking about something. He said he'd been considering getting a small work truck eventually, something practical that he'd actually use for hauling design equipment to client meetings. I asked what kind of truck he was thinking about, and he described a compact model that got decent gas mileage and had enough bed space for his needs. The request felt reasonable because he'd actually started meeting clients in person more often, needing to transport presentation boards and equipment samples. I told him that sounded practical, and offered to help him research reliable options when he was ready to buy. He smiled and accepted the offer, saying he appreciated my input and wanted to make sure he got something that made sense. The conversation felt collaborative and respectful, nothing like the truck disaster from months ago. Victor mentioned he'd been saving money from his personal spending account, planning ahead instead of making impulsive purchases. I realized we were finally in a place where we could discuss major decisions without fighting, where practical actually meant practical, instead of being code for whatever Victor wanted. I looked at Victor across the kitchen table one Saturday morning and something felt different. We were both drinking coffee and reading our phones like normal couples do, but there was this quiet comfort that hadn't existed before. When he asked if I wanted to go grocery shopping together, it wasn't a command or an assumption, just a genuine question about my plans. I realized we'd shifted from 2 people fighting for control to 2 people actually working together. The marriage wasn't perfect, and we still argued about stupid things like whose turn it was to take out the trash, but those arguments stayed small instead of exploding into bigger fights about respect and trust. The truck and boat disaster had forced us to see problems we'd been ignoring for years, and while I wouldn't recommend that method to anyone, I couldn't deny it worked for us. Victor had coffee with his friend James on Thursday afternoon, and when he came home, he mentioned recommending Rekha to him. James was having trouble with his wife making all their financial decisions without asking him, and Victor told him therapy had saved our marriage. I stood there washing dishes and listening to Victor explain how he wished he'd gone to counseling sooner, before things reached the crisis point with the boat. He told James that admitting you need help isn't weakness. It's actually the smart thing to do before your marriage falls apart completely. Hearing Victor advocate for something he'd initially dismissed as touchy-feely nonsense showed me real change. Not just him learning to manage my expectations better. He genuinely believed therapy worked now because he'd experienced it working, and he wanted to help his friend avoid the same mistakes he'd made. We got a letter from our mortgage company about refinancing opportunities with better interest rates, and Victor brought it to me asking what I thought we should do. We sat down together and looked at the numbers, discussing whether the closing costs made sense for the amount we'd save monthly. Victor asked my opinion on whether to go with a 15-year or 30-year term, actually listening when I explained my reasoning about building equity faster versus keeping monthly payments lower. We called 3 different lenders and compared their offers together, making a spreadsheet to track all the details. When we finally chose one, Victor asked me to review the paperwork before he signed anything, treating me as an equal partner in this major financial choice. The whole process felt so different from how he'd handled the truck purchase, where he'd made every decision alone and expected me to just accept it. I felt confident we'd built something more sustainable this time, a marriage based on actual partnership instead of one person pretending to know best. I pulled into our driveway after a 12-hour shift at the hospital. My body tired, but my mind relaxed in a way it hadn't been during those awful truck commutes. The hybrid's engine shut off quietly, and I sat there for a moment, looking at this car that represented so much more than transportation. 3 years of saving $400 every month. the discipline of saying no to other things I wanted, the painful lesson about standing up for myself when someone tried to take what I'd earned. This car symbolized the moment I stopped accepting Victor's decisions as final and started demanding equal say in our life together. My phone buzzed with a text from Victor asking what I wanted for dinner. Such a small domestic question, but one that showed everyday partnership. I smiled and typed back that I was craving pasta, knowing he'd probably already started boiling water because he'd learned to anticipate when I'd be hungry after long shifts. We were finally on solid ground. Not perfect, but real. Two people who'd learned the hard way that marriage only works when both people get a voice.